Welcome to Tech Explain. Today we're diving deep into the world of cybersecurity, specifically CISSP Domain 1. This is a crash course in the essentials. We'll be looking at corporate governance, risk management, and even touch on import-export controls.
Yes, we'll break down these complex concepts, make them a bit more digestible so you can confidently navigate this critical domain.
All right, let's unpack this. First up is corporate governance. It sounds very, boardroom. Why is it so important for security?
You can think of corporate governance as setting the scene for strong security. It's the driving force behind achieving organizational goals, and, well, security is a key player in that. Imagine it as a blueprint for the entire organization. That includes security, too.
Okay, so it's about making sure everyone's on the same page, working towards these goals, and security is kind of woven into that fabric.
Exactly. With security governance, the focus is on ensuring security efforts support broader business goals. Security should be there to help a business succeed, not to hold it back.
That makes a lot of sense. So that it's not about being the department of, shutting everything down because of potential risks.
Right. It's about understanding those risks and finding practical ways to mitigate them. That way, the business can innovate and grow, but in a secure way.
Now, you mentioned something about roles and responsibilities being a critical part of this. What's the key takeaway there?
Clarity. Everyone needs to understand their role in maintaining security. Think of it like a well-oiled machine. Each part needs to be functioning properly, and a crucial distinction is knowing the difference between accountability and responsibility.
I think this is where things get interesting. Tell me more.
Okay, let's say you're using a cloud service provider to store sensitive data. The provider is responsible for things like firewalls, access management, and encryption, the hands-on work.
So they are actively securing the data day to day.
Yes, but you, as the customer, you're ultimately accountable for that data's security. You can't outsource accountability. Think of it like this. If there's a breach, even if it's the provider's fault, you still face the consequences.
That's a critical point. Even if you're relying on a third party, you are still responsible for what happens to your data.
Precisely. It's about due care and due diligence. Due care is taking responsible steps to protect your assets, and due diligence means you can prove you did that. Documentation is key here. Imagine a data breach happens, and you're in court. You'll need to show that you did everything reasonably possible to protect that data. That's due diligence.
So we have this foundation of corporate governance. We know who's responsible and accountable. Now let's talk about the legal and regulatory side. What are some key things to be aware of?
Things can get a little complex here, but we'll break it down. Let's start with import-export controls. You might be surprised that these controls are actually tied to the history of cryptography advancement.
Wait, really? Cryptography and international intrigue. Tell me more.
Back in the 70s and 80s, there were some groundbreaking developments in cryptography. These made encrypting data so secure that even powerful organizations, they couldn't crack it.
It sounds like a digital arms race, with cryptography as the ultimate weapon.
Exactly. And this sparked concern among some governments, leading to laws restricting the export of, advanced cryptographic technologies.
I can see how that would create international tension.
Absolutely. It was a significant period of technological and political change. And those concerns, they can be seen in export control laws like ITAR and IR.
Okay, so ITAR and IR, these are all about controlling the export of these technologies, cryptography included. What's the difference between the two?
ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, focuses specifically on defense articles and services, things like missiles, satellites, and related tech.
So very focused on military applications.
Yes. While IR, or Export Administration Regulations, they cover a broader range of dual-use items with both commercial and military applications.
So even if a technology isn't explicitly for the military, it could still be subject to export controls if it has potential military uses.
Exactly. Companies dealing with such technologies, they need to classify them correctly. Misclassifying something as IR when it should be ITAR, well, that could have serious legal consequences.
Got it. ITAR and IR are both U.S. laws. You mentioned the Wassenaar arrangement earlier. What is that?
The Wassenaar arrangement is a bit different. It's a voluntary agreement between 42 participating countries. It's not like a strict law. It's more about cooperation and information sharing to promote regional and international security.
So what does it cover?
The Wassenaar arrangement, it aims to control the export of conventional weapons and dual-use goods and technologies that could be used to develop those weapons. It's basically a way for these countries to work together, preventing the proliferation of these sensitive items.
Okay, that makes sense. What about these transborder data flow laws? I've been hearing those mentioned more and more lately.
Yes, transborder data flow laws, sometimes called data residency laws. These are becoming increasingly common. They essentially restrict, or in some cases, prevent the flow of data across national borders.
So, for example, a country might require that its citizens' personal data be stored within its own borders.
Exactly. These laws had a huge impact on businesses that operate internationally, as they need to carefully consider where they store and process data.
I see. It creates complexities for global companies. They might need data centers in multiple countries just to comply.
That's right. It's a rapidly changing landscape. Staying informed about these laws is crucial for compliance and protecting data.
And this is all in addition to laws like GDPR, right?
Yes, GDPR is a specific regulation in EU law on data protection and privacy. But many other countries have their own data protection laws too.
It sounds like a bit of a legal minefield out there. Before we move on, I have to ask about privacy. It feels like such a huge topic these days, especially with all the data breaches and privacy scandals we keep hearing about.
You're right, privacy is a massive concern, and it's fundamentally linked to security. You can't achieve privacy without strong security measures to protect that personal data.
So it's not just about ticking the compliance boxes. It's about building a culture of privacy, a respect for data.
Exactly. It's about understanding the entire data lifecycle, how data is created, stored, used, shared, archived, and then finally destroyed. And then, of course, implementing the right security controls at each of those stages.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about ethics. This feels like a bit of a gray area sometimes, especially in the fast-paced world of technology.
You're right. Ethics can be a tricky area, but they're fundamental to cybersecurity. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, and always considering the potential consequences of our actions.
So how do we ensure ethical behavior within an organization?
Clear policies are key. Think of them like corporate laws that guide ethical conduct, turning those ethical principles into actionable rules. They set clear expectations and guide employees on how to navigate these ethical dilemmas.
So it's about setting those boundaries and giving people a framework for making those ethical decisions.
Exactly. One of the most important frameworks in cybersecurity is the ISC Code of Professional Ethics. It outlines 4 key canons that guide ethical decision-making for CISSPs. It's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath for cybersecurity professionals.
Okay, I'm ready for my ethics crash course. What are those 4 canons?
These are really important for the CISSP exam, so pay attention. The first is to protect society, the common good, necessary public trust and confidence, and the infrastructure. It essentially means putting the needs of many above your own personal gain.
Sounds like a good starting point for ethical conduct. What about the second canon?
The second is to act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. It's all about integrity and upholding the law both in your professional and personal life.
Okay, so being a good citizen and a responsible professional. Got it. What's the third one?
The third canon focuses on providing diligent and competent service to your principals. So fulfilling your professional obligations with care and skill. Essentially, it's about doing your job well and exceeding expectations.
Okay, so competence and diligence are key here. That makes sense. And what's the final canon?
The final canon is to advance and protect the profession. This means contributing to the growth and reputation of the cybersecurity field as a whole. It's about mentorship, sharing knowledge, and promoting those ethical practices we've been talking about.
So being an ambassador for the field and upholding its reputation. Okay, those are some strong principles. Now, let's dive into risk management. It feels like this constant puzzle, trying to figure out where to focus our efforts and resources.
Exactly. Risk management is about understanding and mitigating those potential threats. It's a continuous process, and we can break it down into 3 main steps: asset valuation, risk analysis, and risk treatment.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with asset valuation, what's that all about?
Asset valuation is about figuring out what's most important to the organization, their crown jewels. We determine the value of each asset so we can prioritize our protection efforts. You wouldn't spend the same amount protecting a publicly available marketing brochure as you would, say, sensitive customer data.
Right, so it's about knowing what we need to protect the most.
Precisely. There are 2 main approaches to asset valuation: quantitative and qualitative.
I'm guessing quantitative is all about numbers.
Yes, Quantitative analysis assigns a dollar value to each asset. For example, we might say a particular server is worth $10,000 or a customer database is worth $1 million.
But how do you put a price on something like a company's reputation? That's not as straightforward.
That's where qualitative analysis comes in. It's more about ranking. We compare assets and categorize them as high, medium, or low value based on their importance to the organization's operations and mission.
So it's understanding their relative importance, even if we can't put a specific dollar value on them.
Exactly. Now, once we know our assets and their value, we can move on to risk analysis.
Okay, and this is where we start to identify those potential threats and vulnerabilities you mentioned.
Right. Risk analysis looks at 4 key elements: threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and impact. Let's start with threats. A threat is any potential danger that could harm an organization. This could be a natural disaster, a cyber attack, or even, simple human error.
It seems like threats are everywhere, so our job is to identify the ones that pose the greatest risk to our assets.
Exactly. We need to know what we're up against. There are tools and methodologies that help us do this, and one approach is threat modeling.
Okay, tell me about threat modeling. How does that work?
Threat modeling is a way to systematically identify those potential threats. You can think of it like putting yourself in the attacker's shoes, trying to understand how they might try to compromise your systems. There are a few methodologies, but one you should know for the CISP exam is called STRIDE.
Okay, what's STRIDE?
It's a mnemonic, stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. It helps us categorize and consider different attack vectors.
So for each category, we brainstorm potential threats that could exploit that weakness. For spoofing, we might think about phishing attacks.
Exactly. And for tampering, we might consider data modification attacks or man-in-the-middle attacks. By going through each category systematically, we can come up with a wide range of potential threats.
That's a useful tool. So we've got those threats identified using STRIDE. What about vulnerabilities? How do we figure those out?
A vulnerability is a weakness or a gap in an organization's security that could be exploited by a threat. It's like a chink in the armor.
I imagine vulnerabilities can exist anywhere, not just in technology.
Absolutely. They can be in software, hardware, processes, or even human behavior. Identifying and mitigating them is crucial for reducing risk.
So how do we find those vulnerabilities?
There are a couple of key methods. One is a vulnerability assessment. It's like a security checkup. It involves systematically going through systems and applications looking for known weaknesses.
So we're trying to find those weak spots before someone else does. And what's the other method?
The other is penetration testing. It's more active. It simulates real-world attacks to see if vulnerabilities can actually be exploited.
So it's like a controlled attack, testing the defenses. Do organizations usually do both?
It really depends on the organization's resources and risk tolerance. Vulnerability assessments are generally more common because they are less expensive and time-consuming than penetration testing. But pen testing gives more valuable insights because it tests the defenses under those real-world conditions.
Okay, so we've identified our threats and vulnerabilities. How do we figure out the likelihood and impact of those risks?
That's the next step. Likelihood is the probability of that risk actually happening. It's how likely it is that a specific threat will exploit a particular vulnerability. And impact is the potential harm or damage if that risk occurs. It's about understanding the consequences.
So likelihood is about how likely something bad will happen, and impact is about how bad it would be if it did.
Exactly. And just like asset valuation, we can analyze risk quantitatively or qualitatively. Quantitative risk analysis involves assigning specific numbers to likelihood and impact.
So we could say, for example, there's a 10% chance of a specific cyber attack happening, and the impact would be $100,000.
That's a great example. Using numbers, we can try to put a dollar amount on that potential risk. There's a formula that helps. ALE equals SLE times ARO.
Okay, what does that stand for?
ALE stands for annualized loss expectancy, SLE stands for single loss expectancy, and ARO stands for annualized rate of occurrence.
Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. SLE is the estimated financial loss if a risk happens once. It's calculated by multiplying the asset value by what we call the exposure factor, which is the percentage of the asset that would be lost if the risk happened.
So if a server is worth $10,000 and the exposure factor is 50%, then the SLE would be $5,000.
Exactly. ARO is the number of times we think a risk will occur in a year. So if we think that cyber attack will happen once every 2 years, the ARO would be 0.5.
Okay, I'm following so far.
To get the ALE, we multiply the SLE of $5,000 by the ARO of 0.5, which gives us an ALE of $2,500. So that means we could expect to lose about $2,500 every year due to that cyber attack.
Wow, that's really helpful. It really puts things into perspective, but it's probably not always easy to assign those specific numbers, right?
You're right. Quantitative risk analysis can be tough, especially with intangible assets or complex threats. That's where qualitative analysis is useful. It involves ranking risks based on their likelihood and impact, using categories like high, medium, and low. It's more subjective, but still valuable when it comes to prioritizing those risks that are hard to quantify.
So we've got these two different approaches for different situations. So we've got our risks analyzed, we've given them a value, and assessed their likelihood and impact. What happens next?
Now we get to risk treatment. This is where we decide what we're going to do about these risks. There are four main methods: avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept.
Okay, let's go through those. Starting with avoid, what does that mean?
Risk avoidance means taking steps to eliminate the risk completely. If a company is really worried about data breaches, they might choose not to store sensitive data in the cloud. It's about removing the possibility of the risk happening at all.
But isn't it sometimes impossible or impractical to avoid risks altogether?
You're absolutely right. Sometimes we need other ways to manage risk. That's where the other methods come in. Let's talk about risk transfer.
Okay, what's risk transfer?
It's basically shifting the responsibility for a risk to another party. Insurance is a common example. We pay someone else to take on the financial burden of a risk.
So we're outsourcing the financial risk, but not the accountability.
You got it. You might transfer the financial burden, but you're still ultimately responsible for the security of your assets. Insurance can help, but it's not a free pass.
Okay, so insurance is a tool, but not a complete solution. What about mitigation?
Mitigation is like the bread and butter for security professionals. It's all about reducing the likelihood or impact of a risk.
So it's about making it less likely that something bad will happen, or making the consequences less severe if it does.
Precisely. And we do this by implementing controls.
What kind of controls are there?
Controls can be administrative, technical, or physical. Administrative controls are things like policies, procedures, and guidelines. They set the rules of the game.
So it's about establishing clear expectations and processes.
Right. Then there are technical controls. These are the security technologies that we're all familiar with: firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and encryption.
Okay, and what about physical controls?
Physical controls are about protecting the physical assets of the organization. Things like locks, fences, security cameras, and security guards. They're all about securing the physical perimeter, preventing unauthorized access to buildings and equipment.
So we've got this whole range of controls, all designed to mitigate risk. Can we break these categories down even further?
Yes, within these categories, we can talk about safeguards and countermeasures. Safeguards are preventative measures designed to prevent risks from happening in the first place.
Safeguards are like stopping those bad things from happening before they even start.
That's right. Think of safeguards as proactive steps you take to reduce the likelihood of an incident. Countermeasures, on the other hand, are designed to detect and respond to risks that have already occurred.
Okay, so they're like the cleanup crew.
Exactly. Countermeasures are all about damage control and getting things back to normal after something happens.
Safeguards to prevent, countermeasures to respond. And each of these controls needs both functional and assurance aspects.
Yes. The functional aspect is what the control is supposed to do. For example, a firewall's function is to control network traffic. But then we need assurance.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that term. Can you explain?
Sure. The assurance aspect is how we know that a control is working as it should. Are we looking at the firewall logs? Are we regularly testing the control? It's about being confident that the control is doing what it's meant to.
So functionality is about doing the job, and assurance is about knowing it's being done right.
Exactly. And now the final risk treatment method is acceptance.
Okay, so this is where we decide that a risk is small enough that we're willing to just live with it.
That's right. Risk acceptance is consciously deciding to accept the potential consequences of a risk. It's typically used for low-impact risks, or when the cost of mitigation is just too high compared to the potential benefits.
So it's about being realistic, accepting we can't eliminate all risk.
Exactly. Sometimes the cost of implementing a control is just too high for the risk itself. In those cases, it's better to accept the risk and have a plan to handle it if it actually happens.
Makes sense. We've got these four methods: avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept. Is there anything else we need to consider about risk management?
Yes. There are frameworks to help us manage this whole process.
Frameworks. What are those?
Think of them like tried and true recipes for success. They provide a structured and systematic way to approach risk management, making sure we're considering all the elements and aligning with best practices.
So are there many different frameworks out there?
There are, but one that is essential for the CISP exam is the NIST Risk Management Framework, or RMF. It's recognized widely and really comprehensive. Essential knowledge for any security professional.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about the NIST RMF.
The RMF has 7 steps: prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. It guides organizations through the entire risk management process, from understanding their systems and data to putting controls in place and continuously monitoring for risks.
That sounds pretty thorough. Could you maybe walk me through those steps in more detail?
Absolutely. Prepare, the first step, is all about getting ready to implement the framework. We need to establish the context for risk management, assign roles and responsibilities, and dedicate resources. It's about making sure everyone's on the same page and we've got what we need to begin.
So it's about laying that groundwork.
Right. The next step is categorize. This is where we look at what we need to protect. Identifying those systems and information that fall under risk management and then categorizing them based on their sensitivity and importance.
Okay, figuring out what's most crucial to protect. What comes after that?
Next is select, where we focus on the specifics of risk mitigation. We choose the right security controls to mitigate the risks we identified in the previous steps. We need to consider the sensitivity of the data, the potential impact and likelihood of threats, and the cost of implementing those controls.
So choosing the right tool for the job, taking all these factors into account.
Exactly. And then we move on to implement. This is where those controls become a reality. Configuring systems, installing software, and training personnel. It's all about putting those control selections into action.
Making sure they were working and people know how to use them.
Exactly. Then we have assess, which is all about evaluating how effective those controls actually are. This might involve vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, or even just reviewing logs and configurations.
Making sure those controls are working as intended.
Where?
What about authorize? What's that about?
Authorize is where we formally accept any remaining residual risk. This is typically done by a senior manager or executive who can make that decision. They are essentially saying, we understand the risks, we've put in the controls, and we accept the remaining risk.
So acknowledging that we can't get rid of all risk and making an informed decision about how much risk we are willing to accept.
That's right. And lastly, we have monitor, which is the ongoing process of watching our controls, reviewing logs, doing security assessments, and staying informed about new threats.
So constantly checking our security and making adjustments as needed.
Exactly. The RMF is a circular process, not just a one-time thing. We need to continuously monitor and adjust to make sure those controls stay effective in a world where threats are always evolving.
Okay, so the NIST RMF is a pretty comprehensive framework for managing risk. Are there other frameworks we should know about?
There are a few others to be familiar with. There's ISO 31000. It's an international standard for risk management. We also have COSO, a framework from the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and ISACA Risk IT, which is specifically for IT risk management.
So there are many different frameworks, but it sounds like the NIST RMF is the most important one for the CISP exam.
It's definitely a good place to start. It's recognized and comprehensive, covering all the key parts of risk management. Understanding the RMF will give you a strong base for understanding other frameworks as well.
Okay, that's good to know. Now that we've covered the basics of risk management, let's talk about policies. What makes them so essential for a strong security posture?
Think of policies like the internal laws of an organization. They are the rules of the road for security. They set clear expectations and guidelines for doing things properly to minimize risk and protect those valuable assets. Without policies, it's like driving without traffic laws. It would be chaos.
So they aren't just suggestions, they are rules everyone needs to follow. But how do we ensure these policies are actually put into practice and not just sitting on a shelf somewhere?
That's a great question. The key is to keep policies clear, concise, and relevant to people's everyday work. No overly technical or complex language. Everyone in the organization should be able to access them easily.
So it's about being practical and user-friendly, making sure people understand them and actually use them.
Exactly. Regular training and awareness programs are crucial as well, to reinforce those policies and keep them top of mind. If people don't know about the policies or don't understand them, well, they're unlikely to follow them.
Okay, so we've got those clear and concise policies in place. What kinds of policies does an organization usually need?
There's a whole hierarchy of security policies, and each one has a purpose. At the top, we have the overarching security policy. It sets the tone and direction for security in the organization.
It's like the Constitution for security.
Right. It lays out the organization's security goals, objectives, and those high-level principles. Things like confidentiality, integrity, availability, maybe even roles and responsibilities for security. It's the foundation for every other security policy.
Okay, so it sets that foundation. What comes next?
Next are the functional security policies. These are more specific, addressing particular areas of security.
So, like the laws that come from that Constitution, addressing particular concerns.
Precisely. You might have functional policies for things like acceptable use of IT resources, password management, data encryption, incident response, remote access, and many others. They offer more detailed guidance on how to put that overarching policy into action in specific areas.
Okay, getting more detailed at each level. And what comes after functional policies?
Then we have standards, which define mandatory requirements for hardware, software, or configurations.
So standards are those technical specs that make sure everything is consistent and secure.
Exactly. For example, a standard might say which operating systems are allowed on company devices, the minimum password complexity required, or even the specific encryption algorithms that have to be used.
Okay, so standards are about locking things down from a technical point of view. What about procedures?
Procedures provide step-by-step instructions for specific security-related tasks. Think of them like instruction manuals for security operations.
So they give clear guidance for day-to-day tasks, leaving no room for misinterpretation.
Right. Procedures help ensure consistency and reduce the risk of human error. For example, there might be a procedure for reporting a security incident, changing a password, backing up critical data, or even securely getting rid of electronic media.
So procedures provide that detailed guidance. What about baselines?
Baselines define the minimum security settings for systems or applications. They are like the starting point for making those systems secure.
They're like a safety net, ensuring that all systems meet a minimum level of security.
Right. A baseline might specify the required settings for a firewall, the minimum patch level for an operating system, or the default security settings for a web server.
Okay, and lastly, we have guidelines. What are those, and are they mandatory, like standards and procedures?
Guidelines are a bit different. They're recommendations, not hard and fast rules. They offer best practices and advice on security, but they don't have that same force of law like policies, standards, and procedures do.
So guidelines are more like helpful tips and suggestions, offering flexibility and allowing for judgment based on specific situations.
Exactly. They might suggest things like using strong passwords, but they wouldn't mandate a specific password length or complexity.
Okay, so we have policies, standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines, all working together to create this comprehensive framework.
Precisely. They are all vital components of a robust security program, helping to minimize risk, protect those important assets, and ensure consistent practices throughout the organization.
Now, let's talk about privacy. It's become such a major issue these days. Why is that, and how does it connect to security?
Privacy and security, they're two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Security focuses on protecting information from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction. It's about keeping that data safe.
So security is all about the data itself.
Right, and privacy focuses on how we collect, use, share, and manage personal information in a way that respects people's rights and freedoms.
So it's about respecting the individuals behind the data.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that people have control over their information and making sure it's not misused or abused.
Okay, so privacy and security go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work in practice? How do we protect privacy within an organization?
It all begins with a strong privacy policy. This policy outlines how an organization collects, uses, discloses, and manages personal information. It needs to be clear, concise, and easy to understand.
So like a roadmap for handling that personal data responsibly.
That's right. A good privacy policy will state exactly what information is collected, why it's collected, how it will be used, and who it's shared with. It's all about transparency.
Transparency is crucial. What else is important for protecting privacy?
We need to put in place the appropriate security controls to protect personal data from, well, all those things we talked about: unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction. These could include access controls, encryption, data masking, and data loss prevention tools.
So we're using those same security principles and controls, but with a specific focus on personal data.
Exactly. And remember, privacy isn't just about checking the boxes for regulations like GDPR. It's about creating that culture of privacy in the organization where everyone gets the importance of those individual privacy rights.
Creating an environment where privacy is everyone's responsibility, not just the IT department's problem.
You got it. Let's delve into personal data. What exactly counts as personal data, and why is it so vital to protect?
Okay, let's unpack that. What exactly is personal data?
Personal data is any information that relates to an identified or identifiable individual. This includes things like names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, financial info, health info, even online identifiers like IP addresses and cookies. Basically, any information that can be used to identify a person is considered personal data.
It seems like a pretty broad category. Why is it so crucial to protect?
It's important because it's sensitive, and it can be misused if it falls into the wrong hands. Imagine your own medical records or financial information being accessed by someone who shouldn't have it. It could be very harmful.
Okay, so we need to be extremely careful with how we manage personal data. You mentioned different kinds of identifiers. Can you explain what those are?
Of course. Identifiers are pieces of information that can be used to identify someone. We can group them into three categories: direct identifiers, indirect identifiers, and online identifiers.
Okay, let's break those down. What are direct identifiers?
Direct identifiers can directly identify a person all on their own. These include things like government-issued IDs, your social security number, driver's license, passport number, financial account numbers, even biometric data like your fingerprint or facial recognition scans.
So these are the things most closely tied to our identities, the things that really define us as individuals.
Exactly. Then we have indirect identifiers. These can't identify you on their own, but if you have enough of them, you can start to piece together a unique profile of someone. It's like putting a puzzle together. Each piece, each indirect identifier helps reveal the whole picture.
Okay, so connecting.
Okay, so connecting the dots. What kind of info are we talking about here?
Yeah, give me some examples.
Indirect identifiers could be things like age, gender, ethnicity, location, even job title, hobbies, interests.
So even things that seem harmless on their own could be used to identify someone if you collect enough of them.
That's right. And then we've got online identifiers specific to, the online world, things like IP addresses, email addresses, usernames, cookies, device IDs.
Right, those digital trails we leave when we're browsing the internet and using online services.
Exactly. Understanding these different types of identifiers is crucial for privacy because, well, it helps us figure out what information we need to protect to keep people's identity safe. It's about recognizing those puzzle pieces and how they fit together.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the data lifecycle. You touched on this before, but I think it's important to unpack it a bit more.
Definitely. The data lifecycle is a framework for understanding the different stages data goes through, from creation to destruction. And knowing this lifecycle is key for applying the right security and privacy controls at each stage.
Okay, so what are those different stages?
First, we have creation or update, where new data is made or existing data is changed. It's how data enters the system.
Okay, what happens next?
Then it's the storage stage, where the data is stored somewhere, like a hard drive, a database, or the cloud. This is where the data lives.
Got it. And then?
Then there's the use stage, where the data is accessed and processed for various reasons. This is where the data gets put to work.
So we create the data, store it, and then use it. What's the next step?
Next comes the share stage, where we share that data with others, maybe within the organization or outside of it. It's where the data travels.
Okay, and then what?
Next is the archive stage. Data that's no longer being actively used gets moved to long-term storage, maybe for compliance or legal reasons. It's kind of like where data goes to rest, but might still need to be accessible.
So not deleted yet, just tucked away for safekeeping.
Right. And finally, we have the destroy stage, where the data is permanently erased or destroyed. This is the very end of the data's life.
So it's important to have the right security and privacy controls for each of these stages.
Absolutely. Understanding the entire life cycle helps us implement those controls properly for each step of the data's journey.
Okay, so how does data classification come into play here?
Data classification is about categorizing data based on its sensitivity and importance. This helps us figure out the level of protection that data needs at each stage of its life.
So we're giving different types of data a security rating.
Yes. Highly sensitive data, like financial information or health records, needs much stronger protection than less sensitive data, like, say, public marketing materials.
Right, so data classification helps us focus our security and privacy efforts on the data that matters most, the data that needs the strongest controls.
Exactly. It's a key part of the process. Now, let's look at some international guidelines and regulations for privacy. There are a bunch of laws and frameworks globally, but one set of guidelines that's really important is the OECD privacy principles.
Okay, what's the OECD and what are these principles all about?
The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's got 38 member countries, and they work to promote economic growth and development. The OECD privacy principles are 8 principles that provide guidance on how to handle personal data responsibly.
So like international best practices for privacy.
Exactly. They're not legally binding, but they are well respected and have shaped the development of privacy laws around the world. They cover things like limiting data collection, making sure the data is accurate, being clear about why data is being collected, putting security safeguards in place, and letting people access and correct their data.
Wow, that's pretty thorough. Are there any regulations that are legally binding?
Yes, and one that's crucial for the CISSP exam is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation.
Okay, GDPR. I've heard a lot about that one.
Hmm.
Can you give me the rundown on what it is and why it's so important?
Of course. GDPR is a regulation in EU law on data protection and privacy in the European Economic Area, EEA. It also deals with the transfer of personal data outside the EEA. GDPR aims to give control to individuals over their personal data and to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by unifying the regulation within the EU.
So it's about giving individuals more power and making a consistent privacy landscape in Europe. Does it apply to organizations outside of Europe as well?
Yes, it does. GDPR applies to any organization that processes personal data from individuals in the EEA, no matter where the organization is located.
So even if a company is based in the US, but they're handling data from European citizens, they still have to follow GDPR.
That's right. And it's got strict requirements. Things like getting consent for data collection, minimizing the amount of data collected, making sure data is accurate, putting security measures in place, and letting people access and correct their data.
Sounds like organizations need to have their act together to comply with GDPR.
Absolutely. One of the key things is reporting data breaches to authorities within 72 hours of finding out about them.
Wow, that's not much time. It really highlights the importance of having strong security measures to try to stop those breaches from happening in the first place.
Exactly. The faster you can find and react to a breach, the less damage it's likely to cause.
Okay, so GDPR is about protecting those privacy rights for people in Europe. And it's had a ripple effect globally, with many other countries taking inspiration from it for their own laws.
That's true. GDPR has set a new standard for data protection, and you can see its influence in privacy regulations worldwide.
Now, before we move on from privacy, let's quickly touch on intellectual property. I know it's not exactly the same as personal data, but it's still an important asset to protect.
Absolutely. Intellectual property, or IP, refers to those creations of the mind. Things like inventions, literary works, designs, symbols, names, images used in commerce. Protecting IP is crucial for promoting innovation and economic growth. It's about protecting the results of creativity and ingenuity.
So we have laws to protect these creations. What are the different types of intellectual property rights?
There are 4 main types: patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets.
Okay, let's start with patents. What are those?
Patents are exclusive rights that are given for an invention. They let the patent holder stop others from making, using, or selling that invention for a certain period, typically 20 years from when the application was filed.
So it's like a temporary monopoly on a new invention.
Exactly. It encourages innovation by giving inventors that exclusive right, so it helps attract investment in research and development.
Okay, so patents protect inventions. What about trademarks?
A trademark is a sign that can distinguish the goods or services of one company from those of others. It's all about brand identity and reputation.
Things like logos, brand names, slogans, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Trademarks can be words, logos, symbols, designs, even sounds or smells, like the MGM lion's roar or the shape of a Coca-Cola bottle.
Right. Trademarks help customers recognize and differentiate products and services. What about copyrights?
Copyrights protect original works of authorship, like literary, dramatic, musical, and certain other intellectual creations. It's all about protecting the expression of ideas.
So this is about protecting those who create books, music, movies, software.
Exactly. Copyrights give creators those exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, display, perform, and create new works based on their original creation. It prevents others from making money from their work without permission.
Okay, so patents for inventions, trademarks for brands, and copyrights for creative works. What about trade secrets?
Trade secrets are a little different. They're pieces of information that companies keep secret to give them an edge over their competition. Things like formulas, practices, designs, or just a collection of information.
So like the recipe for Coca-Cola would be a trade secret.
Precisely. The legal protection for trade secrets relies on keeping that information confidential. If the secret gets out, the protection is lost.
So different ways to protect different types of intellectual property. It's important for organizations to understand these and take steps to protect what's theirs.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about security, privacy, and intellectual property. How does all of this tie in with import-export controls? We mentioned them earlier, but maybe we can delve a bit deeper.
Yes, let's go back to that. You said these controls are really important when it comes to cryptography. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Import-export controls are regulations that govern how goods, software, and technology move across national borders. And when we're talking about security and privacy, these controls become especially important for cryptography. It can be used for both good and bad.
Right. It's about controlling the flow of those sensitive technologies that can encrypt data and protect communications, making sure they don't fall into the wrong hands.
Exactly. Cryptography is really powerful for protecting information, but it can also be used for harmful things if it gets into the wrong hands. Think about criminals hiding their activities with strong encryption, or even countries using encryption to protect their military communications.
So governments want to make sure that powerful encryption technologies don't end up with people who might use them for bad things.
Precisely. That's where those export control laws like ITAR and IR come in. They're meant to regulate the export of these technologies, cryptography included, to protect national security and prevent things like weapons of mass destruction from spreading.
Right, ITAR focuses on defense-related things, while EAR has that broader scope covering those dual-use items.
Exactly. These laws are complex, and breaking them can have serious consequences. Organizations need to be careful with how they handle these technologies and make sure they're following all the rules.
It seems like it's a constantly changing landscape. What are some of the challenges for organizations trying to keep up with these export control laws?
One of the biggest challenges is just keeping up with those changes. These laws are constantly being updated, and it can be hard for organizations to stay on top of them. Plus, a lot of the regulations are tricky to understand, and that can lead to accidental violations.
So having experts who can guide you through those complexities is really important.
Absolutely. Having a legal and compliance team who knows these regulations inside and out is vital for any organization that deals with these kinds of technologies.
Okay, so export controls for sensitive tech. Are there any other legal or regulatory things to keep in mind?
Oh, there are plenty. It's a huge and ever-changing landscape, but let's highlight a few key areas. First, there are data breach notification laws. These require organizations to let people and/or authorities know if there's been a data breach.
So these laws are about being transparent and accountable when sensitive information is compromised.
Exactly. They're meant to make sure that individuals know about breaches that could affect them and that organizations are held responsible for protecting that information. These laws can vary depending on where you are, so it's important to understand the specifics for the places where you do business.
Okay, so data breach notification is something to keep on the radar. Anything else?
Intellectual property law, which we talked about earlier, is another one. Organizations need to have policies and procedures to protect their IP, like their trademarks, patents, copyrights, and trade secrets.
Right, we need to safeguard those creative creations. Any other legal areas to be mindful of?
Well, we also have laws and regulations that are specific to certain industries, like healthcare, finance, and government. These often have their own unique security and privacy requirements that organizations need to comply with.
So it's really about understanding the specific legal and regulatory rules for your industry and location. What are some good resources for staying informed about these changes?
There are a lot of helpful resources out there, like industry publications, government websites, legal databases. It's also a good idea to get advice from legal professionals to make sure your organization is meeting its obligations.
Okay, so it's a complicated area, and it's important to stay informed and get expert advice when needed. Now, before we finish up with Domain 1, let's go back to that idea of thinking like a CEO. I think that's a really important shift in mindset for security professionals, and I want to make sure we understand what it means practically.
I agree, it's a crucial concept. Thinking like a CEO in security means looking past the technical stuff and seeing the bigger picture. Understanding the business goals and how security fits in. Thinking strategically about risk and making smart decisions that balance security with other priorities.
So it's about aligning security with the organization's mission and objectives.
Exactly. It's about understanding how security decisions affect the bottom line, the legal and regulatory landscape, and the importance of communication and stakeholder management. It's about being a leader who gets how crucial security is for the success of the organization.
That's a great takeaway. Now, before we move on, let's quickly revisit due care and due diligence. Can you explain what those terms mean and why they're so important?
Of course, due care and due diligence are fundamental to security governance. Due care refers to that legal standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise in a given situation.
So acting responsibly and taking precautions to prevent harm.
Exactly. When it comes to cybersecurity, due care means having reasonable security measures in place to protect that sensitive information and systems.
Okay, so it's about doing what's expected to protect the things that are entrusted to us.
Precisely. Due diligence is the process of really investigating and understanding those risks the organization faces. This means conducting risk assessments, implementing security controls, watching out for threats, and responding to incidents.
So it's about being proactive and thorough, not just waiting for something bad to happen.
Exactly. And due care and due diligence go hand in hand. By being diligent, organizations show that they are taking care and protecting their assets.
Okay, so it's about proving that we are serious about security and doing everything we can to protect our assets.
Right. Showing due care and due diligence is also essential for following legal and regulatory requirements. If an organization has a security breach, regulators will want to know if they did everything they could to prevent it. Did they exercise due care and due diligence?
So it's not just about protecting our assets, it's about protecting the organization from legal and financial trouble if something goes wrong.
Exactly. Due care and due diligence are essential for a strong security position and a key aspect of good security governance.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Corporate governance, legal frameworks, risk management, privacy, intellectual property, all seen through the lens of CISSP Domain 1. What else is there to explore in this domain?
Let's talk about awareness, training, and education. These are often overlooked, but they're crucial for any solid security program. They help build what we call a human firewall, which can be even more effective than any technology.
Okay, a human firewall. I like that. So why are awareness, training, and education so important?
They're vital because they give people in an organization the ability to make good decisions about security and to spot and respond to potential threats. Having good technology and policies isn't enough. We need to make sure people understand them and know how to use them properly.
So it's about building that security conscious culture we talked about, where everyone takes responsibility for security.
Exactly. We need everyone to be on the lookout, understand the risks, and know how to protect themselves and the organization. Awareness is about raising that general awareness of security issues and promoting that security-minded culture.
So it's about making security part of everyone's job. What about training? How's that different from awareness?
Training is more focused. It's about giving people specific skills and knowledge related to security. This could be training on how to use particular tools, how to identify phishing emails, how to make strong passwords, or how to report security incidents.
So giving people the know-how to do their jobs securely. And what about education? What does that fit in?
Education is about developing a deeper understanding of the ideas and principles behind security. It's not just about skills and knowledge, it's about helping people understand the why behind security measures. It's about developing critical thinking skills so they can make informed security decisions in different situations.
So it's about building a more sophisticated understanding of the threats and how to handle them. Are there different ways to deliver awareness, training, and education?
Absolutely. Lots of methods, each with their pros and cons. Classroom training is common, where people attend in-person sessions led by a security expert. This can be really effective for detailed info and interaction, but it can also be time-consuming and expensive, especially for large organizations.
That makes sense. What about online training? Is that an option?
Online training is becoming increasingly popular. It's more flexible and cost-effective than traditional classroom training. Employees can go through online modules at their own pace and on their own time. It's a good way to reach a larger audience and can even offer more tailored learning experiences.
So online training offers convenience and flexibility. What about awareness campaigns? How do those differ?
Awareness campaigns are designed to raise general awareness about security issues and foster a culture of security. Think Posters, flyers, emails, videos, or even interactive games. They often focus on specific topics like phishing or password security and use catchy slogans and visuals to stick in people's minds.
So keeping security top of mind in a creative way.
Exactly. Awareness campaigns are great for adding to formal training and education. They help reach more people and keep security in the forefront.
Okay, so awareness, training, and education, all key for a robust security program, helping to build that human firewall and make the organization stronger. What else should we think about as part of security governance?
Another important area is procurement. It might not be the most exciting part of security, but it's crucial.
Procurement, what does that have to do with security?
Think about it this way. Every time an organization buys new hardware or software, it's like introducing new risks into the environment. Those purchases could have security holes, or they might not fit with the organization's security policies.
So it's not just about getting a good deal, it's about making sure those purchases don't weaken the organization's security.
Exactly. Security needs to be involved in the procurement process from the very beginning. We need to work closely with the procurement team to make sure security is considered at every step, from deciding what's needed to choosing vendors and making contracts.
Okay, what should security pros be looking for during that procurement process?
First, we need to understand the business requirements. What is the organization hoping to achieve with this purchase? What are the functional needs? And just as important, what are the security needs?
So those security requirements need to be laid out clearly from the start.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about a service, those requirements should be documented in a service level requirements document, or SLR.
Okay, what's an SLR?
An SLR outlines the security expectations for the service provider. It details things like data security, access controls, encryption requirements, incident response procedures, and security audits. It becomes really important when we're evaluating different vendors.
So we can use that SLR to compare vendors and see if they can actually meet our security needs.
Exactly. It's all about due diligence in that procurement process.
And what happens once a vendor is chosen?
Those requirements from the SLR are then put into a legally binding document called a service level agreement, or SLA. The SLA is more detailed, outlining specific services, performance goals, and very importantly, security responsibilities.
So the SLA spells out exactly what the vendor has to do when it comes to security.
Exactly. That's how we make sure they understand their responsibilities and can be held accountable if they don't meet those security requirements. It's about protecting the organization.
Okay, we've got those contracts and SLAs in place. But what about the people involved? How do we make sure everyone in the organization knows their part in keeping things secure? We talked about awareness, training, and education, but can you expand on how they fit into the bigger picture?
Those are absolutely key for ensuring everyone in the organization understands their role in maintaining security. We need to get past the idea that security is IT's problem. It's everyone's responsibility.
Right, creating that culture of security that we keep coming back to.
Exactly. And it's not just about telling people they are responsible. We need to give them the knowledge and skills to actually fulfill those responsibilities.
So how do we do that?
Awareness programs are a good way to start. They raise general awareness about security issues and promote a security-conscious culture. This might involve things like posters, flyers, emails, videos, even interactive games. Keeping the messages clear and engaging, focusing on the things people need to know to protect themselves and the organization.
Awareness is about laying that foundation of knowledge and understanding. What about training?
Training is more focused. It's about teaching specific skills and knowledge related to security. This might include things like password security, phishing awareness, social engineering, mobile device security. Data protection really depends on the role of the individual.
So it's equipping people with the right tools and techniques for different kinds of threats.
Exactly. The training needed will vary depending on the person's job. Someone in finance might need training on protecting financial data, while someone in customer service needs to know how to handle sensitive customer information.
Okay, so training needs to be relevant to the individual's role. What about education? How does that fit in?
Education is about developing a deeper understanding of those security principles and concepts. It goes beyond just skills and knowledge, helping people understand the why behind the security measures.
So it's about helping them think critically and make smart decisions about security, even in new situations where they haven't had specific training.
Precisely. It's about encouraging people to be proactive and think about security in everything they do.
That's a really important concept. So how do we deliver this education? Is it like training, with classroom sessions and online modules?
It can be, but education can also be delivered in less formal ways, like lunch and learn sessions, seminars, or even just casual discussions with colleagues.
So creating a culture where people are always learning and sharing knowledge about security.
Exactly. The more we teach people about security and empower them to own it, the stronger our overall security will be.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have awareness to build the foundation, training to provide those specific skills, and education to deepen that understanding and encourage critical thinking. It's a multifaceted approach to building that human firewall.
Exactly. And it's not just a one-time thing. Security awareness, training, and education need to be ongoing. We need to constantly reinforce those messages, keep people informed about new threats, and give them the tools and resources to stay safe.
Right. It's a journey, not a destination. Okay, we've covered a lot when it comes to Domain 1. Anything else we need to cover before we move on?
There's one more area we haven't talked about yet. Physical security. It often gets overlooked in this digital world, but it's still a crucial part of security governance.
Okay, physical security. That makes sense. We spent a lot of time talking about data and systems, but we can't forget about the physical stuff too, right?
Exactly. Physical security is about protecting people, property, and assets from physical threats. Things like theft, vandalism, fire, natural disasters, even terrorism.
So protecting the organization's buildings and the people working in them.
Precisely. And it's not just about preventing those threats, it's also about reducing the damage they could cause.
Okay, so what are some physical security controls? We talked about them when we were discussing risk mitigation, but could you remind me?
Sure. We can group physical security controls into three types: administrative, technical, and physical controls.
Okay, let's go through them. Starting with administrative controls. What are they?
Administrative controls are those policies, procedures, and guidelines meant to manage and control physical security risks. Examples could be things like visitor management procedures, background checks for employees, security awareness training, and incident response plans.
So it's about setting the rules for behavior to maintain a secure physical environment.
Exactly. Now, what about those technical controls?
I'm guessing those involve technology?
You got it. Technical controls use technology to improve physical security. Things like access control systems, intrusion detection systems, video surveillance, fire alarm systems.
Okay, so these are the tools we use to detect and prevent physical threats. And finally, we have physical controls.
Yes, physical controls are those physical barriers and measures meant to stop unauthorized access to assets. Think fences, gates, locks, barriers, lighting, security guards. It's about creating that physical barrier between potential threats and what we're trying to protect.
So making it harder for someone to get into restricted areas or mess with equipment or data.
Exactly. And just like other security controls, it's important to have layers of protection. We don't want to rely on just one thing. We need multiple layers for a stronger defense.
That makes a lot of sense. What are some key things to think about when implementing these physical security controls?
One of the first things is understanding the threats. What specific physical dangers are we most worried about? Theft, vandalism, natural disasters, terrorism. Knowing the threats helps us design and implement the right controls to address them.
So understanding the risks and choosing security measures to address those specific risks.
Exactly. We also need to consider how sensitive the assets we're protecting are. Not all assets are equal. Some things, like data centers or executive offices, need a higher level of security.
Right. We have to be smart with our resources and make sure the most critical assets are the most protected.
Absolutely. And then there's the cost of those controls. Physical security can be pricey, so it's important to find that balance between security and what's affordable.
So we need to do our homework, weigh the risks, and make informed decisions about which controls are necessary.
Exactly. And don't forget, physical security isn't just about technology and barriers. It's about people, too. Employees need to be aware of their responsibilities and know what to do if something happens.
So that security awareness training is just as important for physical security as it is for cybersecurity.
Absolutely. We need everyone on board.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in Domain 1. Corporate governance, legal frameworks, risk management, privacy, intellectual property, awareness, training, education, procurement, and physical security. Is there anything else we should touch on?
I think we've hit the main points of Domain 1. The big takeaway is that security governance is about setting the stage for a secure and resilient organization, getting the basics right, and understanding those key principles of effective security management.
That's a great way to sum it up. What are some key takeaways for our listeners who are studying for the CISSP exam?
One of the most important things to remember is that the CISSP exam is about thinking like a security leader. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about understanding the concepts and applying them to real-life situations.
So being able to think strategically about security and see the bigger picture, what else should they keep in mind?
Don't underestimate Domain 1. It's the foundation for all the other domains in the CISSP-CBK. Make sure you really understand those concepts of security governance, risk management, legal and regulatory compliance, and everything we've discussed.
Right, it's all connected. Domain 1 is the foundation for everything else. Any other advice?
Practice, practice, practice. There are tons of resources out there to help you get ready for the exam, practice questions, study guides, online courses. Use them and get as much practice as you can.
Great advice. Practice makes perfect, or as close to it as we can get.
Well, I think we've covered about all we can on Domain 1 for now. Any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Security governance is an ongoing process, not a one-time thing. It's about constantly assessing risks, implementing controls, watching for threats, and adapting to the changing threat landscape.
So staying vigilant, being proactive, and never stop learning.
Exactly. And remember, security is everyone's responsibility. We all have a part to play in making a more secure world. Well said. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into CISSP Domain 1. We hope this was helpful as you continue on your CISSP journey. Stay tuned for more episodes where we'll explore the other domains. Until next time, stay safe. Okay, so we've covered a ton in Domain 1. Corporate governance, legal frameworks, risk management, privacy, intellectual property, awareness, training, education, procurement, physical security. Is there anything else we need to touch on?
I think we've really hit all the essentials of Domain 1. The key takeaway here is that security governance is all about establishing that foundation for a secure and resilient organization, getting that big picture right, understanding the core principles of effective security management.
That's a great way to summarize it. So for our listeners who are preparing for the CISSP exam, what are some of the most important takeaways?
Well, one of the big things to keep in mind is that the CISSP exam is all about thinking like a leader in security. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of facts and figures.
It's about seeing that bigger picture and thinking strategically about security. What else should our listeners keep in mind as they're studying?
Don't underestimate Domain 1. It lays the groundwork for every other domain in the CISSP common body of knowledge. So make sure you have a solid understanding of security governance, risk management, legal and regulatory compliance, and all those topics we've discussed.
Right, it's all connected. Domain 1 is the foundation for everything that comes after. Any other advice you'd give to someone prepping for the exam?
Practice, practice, practice. There's so many resources out there to help you prepare, practice questions, study guides, online courses. Take advantage of those resources. Get as much practice as you can.
Great advice. Practice is key. Well, I think we've covered just about everything we can on Domain 1 for now. As we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Remember that security governance is a continuous process. It's not a one-and-done kind of thing. It's about constantly evaluating your risks, implementing controls, staying aware of those threats, and adapting as the threat landscape changes.
Always be vigilant, be proactive, and keep learning.
Exactly. And never forget that security is everyone's responsibility. We all have a role to play in building a more secure world.
Well said. A huge thank you for joining us for this deep dive into CISP Domain 1. We hope you found it insightful and helpful on your CISSP journey. Be sure to tune in for our future episodes where we'll explore the other domains of the CISP-CBK. Until then, stay secure.